Good evening. Tonight I'm going to be talking about zoos in literature. Zoos in books can be a great source of entertainment and intrigue. And hence, this evening I am dressed as many different animals. Thank you, Rika, for this lovely non-real animal coat. And lovely to see you joining me here this evening. I'm not going to be talking about zoos in children's books, just to warn you. I will do that another day because I think that is also a great topic. And there are lots of really fantastic zoos in children's books. There's hundreds of baby books dedicated to zoos, which I used to read to my children. Dear Zoo, for instance, many of which are great favourites. But I wanted to talk this evening about zoos in adult literature. And do please tell me if there's any that I miss out, which is highly likely. But I wanted to start with what I think is the absolute classic of zoos. Oh, you can't hear anything, says Claire. That's worrying. I wonder why that would be. Hang on, let me just do a bit of fiddling. Can other people hear me? I don't know if that's an issue my end. Please let me know if you can hear or not. Um, Nat, you've just joined. Can you hear me? Claire has just said that she can't hear me, and I'm worried that something might be going wrong. Please let me know, anyone, if you can hear or not. Justine, can you hear? Oh, you can. Excellent, thank you. So we're going to start with the classic of zoo literature, in my opinion, which is Gerald Durrell's A Zoo in My Luggage. I don't actually have that book in front of me. I've got the Corfu trilogy, which is another brilliant Gerald Durrell book, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. My Family and Other Animals, which is one of my favourite ever books, and which is a book that completely probably made me the person that I am. So Gerald Durrell, for people that don't know about him, was one of the first ever zoologists who actually took the plight and the welfare of animals seriously and was obsessed with helping endangered species to live successfully. And he spent his entire life dedicated to finding and bringing back rare species and putting them in zoos, which I know are controversial places, but he was very much dedicated to educating people about animals and to showing them how they live and to making zoos an immersive experience so that people could actually learn about animals. So My Family and Other Animals is the autobiographical story of how Gerald Durrell was brought up in Corfu by his mother, living an absolutely idyllic life, seemingly, and I think literally, where they lived in a strawberry pink villa. And Gerald used to run around the island collecting animals and looking after them. And he was always, from an early age, obsessed with keeping animals to the best of his ability. He wasn't just trapping them and abusing them in any way. He was actually looking after them. That has to be said. And the book A Zoo in My Luggage is the true and hilarious story of how Gerald Durrell and his wife set up their own zoo in Jersey. So they travelled to the Cameroons, helped by the renowned Fon of Buffut, and managed to collect, as it was called at the time, plenty beef, meaning lots of animals. And their difficulties obviously began when they started to bring back the animals, hence A Zoo in My Luggage, but also when they got the animals back home, these exotic and beautiful animals that they had to look after both in their hotel rooms and then when they got back to England. So, just to give you a bit more background on Jerry Durrell, he was born in 1925 and he was an esteemed British naturalist, conservationist and writer, renowned for his captivating memoirs and extensive knowledge of wildlife. He's been one of the most influential writers about wildlife, uh, and was actually contemporary and friend of David Attenborough, as you can imagine. And by the way, my obsession with zoos currently is because my daughter Calypso is actually doing an internship in a place which is related to Chester Zoo. It's not actually at Chester Zoo, but she's working on a farm with an amazing woman who works at Chester Zoo. And on this farm, there's all sorts of amazing animals. And the lady running the farm knew Jerry Durrell. And I'm pretty obsessed with Gerald Durrell, as you can imagine. And so it was very thrilling to meet this fabulous woman. And my daughter's having a very fascinating time at the moment, being an intern on this farm and meeting lots of rare and exotic beasts while she's there. Obviously, there will be visits to Chester Zoo as well. So I know zoos are controversial places in real life. But by the way, Chester Zoo is renowned for being the most brilliant zoo in the whole of Europe for helping to conserve and help with endangered species. So it's doing all sorts of amazing work. And Chester Zoo has strong connections with Kent University, where you can do a degree in ecology and conservation. And they have massive connections with DICE, which is the Durrell Institute of Conservation, which is the Gerald Durrell Institute. So it all comes back to Gerald Durrell. Basically, my entire life is clearly founded on reading My Family and Other Animals, which I read when I was about 10 and have reread several times since. And also A Zoo in My Luggage and the various other books that Gerald Durrell wrote about his animal collection. So Gerald Durrell founded the Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust in 1959, which became internationally recognised for its efforts in conservation and breeding rare species. Durrell was a man of boundless enthusiasm and brilliant storytelling powers. And in his book, A Zoo in My Luggage, he gives a wonderful glimpse into the life of a dedicated conservationist while simultaneously offering an immersive escape into the wild wonders of the animal kingdom. So one of the particular chapters that is in A Zoo in My Luggage is all about how Gerald Durrell brought back the AA, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, AYE, AYE, I think it might be II, which is a little monkey-like creature which was native entirely to Madagascar and was horribly endangered. And Gerald Durrell was completely obsessed with bringing back some eyes to Jersey so as to show them to the world in Europe and let people know about these incredible creatures. I think eyes are now quite fairly comparatively common in zoos, but this was the first time that anyone had managed to bring some back from the wild into captivity. And in his book, A Zoo in My Luggage, Gerald Durrell has a really fantastic description of how he captures the eyes and brings them back and then manages to take them back to Jersey. The logistics involved in transporting the eyes were incredibly challenging because they require very much special care and attention, and they're highly sensitive to stress and discomfort. And Durrell meticulously planned every stage of their journey, obviously ensuring that their welfare was prioritized above all else. But one of the wonderful things about Durrell and about the great zoo enthusiasts of his era was that he was kind of making it up as he went along and trying to do his absolute best. But there's obviously always massive elements of chaos and surprise and absurdity in the world of animals. And with health and safety all being a lot more lax in those days, than it is now. And people in zoos nowadays do talk about the ways that things have changed, because back in the day, people were a bit more gung-ho, and they used to go and walk into the cages with the animals, hang out with the tigers, get to know the lions all too well, and basically take what would now be considered terrible risks. But of course, the fact that they were going into the cages every day meant that the animals did know them and gave them a healthy respect. Whereas now that we have super health and safety, people are not allowed to go into the cages, which obviously is sensible, but it also means that the animals don't have that daily dose of humanity. So then if a human does go into a cage, things can get a lot more nasty. So it's obviously a very difficult scenario to balance whether you can have any kind of regular contact with wild animals or not. And is it a good thing if you do anyway? All very interesting. So there's a lot of fascinating discussion about animals and the way that you work with them in all of these books that I'm going to be talking about this evening. So we've started off with A Zoo in My Luggage by Gerald Durrell. And Durrell firmly believed that a zoo should not be seen as merely a place for entertainment, but rather as a platform for education and awareness. And to this end, he did make sure that his zoo in Jersey provided a totally immersive experience to the visitors. And he was also obsessed with preserving not only individual species, but entire habitats of the species, because he understood that the loss of even a single species could have far-reaching consequences for the delicate balance of nature. He was an amazingly inspiring person, and his efforts to establish a zoo in Jersey and protect endangered species highlight the importance of preserving the endangered species and their habitats. So that's A Zoo in A Zoo in Our Luggage by Gerald Durrell, which is a fantastic book, and I would say a must read for everyone. And also, while you're at it, if you haven't read My Family and Other Animals yet, read it now. So moving on, another fantastic zoo book is We Bought a Zoo by Benjamin Mee, which is a true story that was turned into a Hollywood blockbuster film starring Matt Damon and Scarlett Johansson, which I actually saw, I have to admit, before reading the book, and didn't realise that it was based on, well, I realised it was a true story, but I didn't realise it was a true story from the UK. The true story relates to Benjamin Mee, who was a former British newspaper columnist, who describes in his book how he uprooted his family to the English countryside and purchased a dilapidated zoo, which was in Dartmoor. So apparently, he and his wife went along to this dilapidated zoo just to rule it out as a possible place to live. They had no experience in looking after zoo animals whatsoever. But when they went to this rundown zoo, which had been apparently really depressing and essentially badly run, then they fell in love with the place and couldn't resist buying it, because they also realized that if they didn't buy it, all of the animals therein would probably be destroyed. And there are all these really tragic tigers floating around who Benjamin Mee and his wife decided that they must save. But it also, it is a true story. It also has a very sad aspect that his wife actually dies. And it's a really brilliant story. I'd recommend both the film and the book. So that's True Story. We Bought a Zoo by Benjamin Mee, M-E-E. So now I've got a few other exciting books to mention, but I must thank John Mullen, who wrote a really fantastic article all about the best zoos in literature. And I have to admit that I did comb through that to find some of the ones that I'm going to talk about this evening. But I think the other zoo that comes to mind to people nowadays, apart from Gerald Durrell Zoo, is the zoo in The Life of Pi by Jan Martel. Has anyone read this recently? Such a fantastic book, winner of the Booker Prize 2002. So, can you believe it? It was written 22 years ago, sold millions of copies worldwide, and been made into a film and a play. And it is basically an amazing, brilliant, surreal, kind of magical realist read. But it all begins because the boy who is the hero of the book, who is called Pi because he's named after a swimming pool, piscine. So he's actually called Piscine, which one forgets. I think you tend to think he's called Pi because it's something to do with maths, but no, it's all about the swimming pool. So Pi actually grows up in India, in Pondicherry, in a zoo. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about the zoo that he grows up in, because I think he writes about it really well. And Jan Martel is someone that generally writes about animals and the consciousness of animals, I think, rather brilliantly. So here we go. This is right from the very near the beginning of the book. In zoos, as in nature, the best times to visit are sunrise and sunset. That is when most animals come to life. They stir and leave their shelter and tiptoe to the water's edge. They show their raiments. They sing their songs. They turn to each other and perform their rites. The reward for the watching eye and the listening ear is great. I spent more hours than I can count, a quiet witness to the highly mannered, manifold expressions of life that grace our planet. It is something so bright, loud, weird, and delicate as to stupefy the senses. Just going back a bit to where he's describing growing up as a child in the zoo. To me, it was paradise on earth. I have nothing but the fondest memories of growing up in a zoo. I lived the life of a prince. What Maharaja's son had such a vast, luxuriant grounds to play about? What palace had such a menagerie? My alarm clock during my childhood was a pride of lions. They were no Swiss clocks, but the lions could be counted upon to roar their heads off between 5:30 and 6 every morning. Imagine that, being woken up by a pride of lions. They were no Swiss clocks. Oh, sorry, I've just had that. Breakfast was punctuated by the shrieks and cries of howler monkeys, hill miners, and Moluccan cockatoos. I left for school under the benevolent gaze, not only of mother, but also of bright-eyed otters and burly American bison and stretching and yawning orangutans. I looked up as I ran under some trees. Otherwise, peafowl might excrete on me. Better to go by the trees than sheltered the large colonies of fruit bats. The only assault there at that early hour was the bats' discordant concerts of squeaking and chattering. On my way out, I might stop by the terraria to look at some shiny frogs, glazed bright, bright green, or yellow and deep blue, or brown and pale green. Or it might be birds that caught my attention. Pink flamingos or black swans or one-wattled cassowaries or something smaller, silver diamond doves, Cape glossy starlings, peach-faced lovebirds, Nande conures, orange-fronted parakeets. Not likely that the elephants, the seals, the big cats or the bears would be up and doing, but the baboons, the macaques, the mangabes, the gibbons, the deer, the tapirs, the llamas, the giraffes, the mongooses were early risers. Every morning before I was out the main gate, I had one last impression that was both ordinary and unforgettable: a pyramid of turtles, the iridescent snout of a mandrill, the stately silence of a giraffe, the obese yellow open mouth of a hippo, the beak and claw climbing of a macaw parrot up a wire fence, the greeting claps of a shoebill's bill, the senile, lecherous expression of a camel. And all these riches were had quickly as I hurried to school. It was after school that I discovered in a leisurely way what it's like to have an elephant search your clothes in the friendly hope of finding a hidden nut, or an orangutan pick through your hair for tick snacks. Its wheeze of disappointment at what an empty pantry your head is. I wish I could convey the perfection of a seal sloughing into water, or a spider monkey swinging from point to point, or a lion merely turning its head. but language founders in such seas, better to picture it in your head if you want to feel it. So that's a lovely description of the zoo, and there's a lot more fantastic description at the beginning of the book. But then for people that know the story, that have perhaps seen the film, hopefully you have read the book, we're talking about the life of Pi, you all know that the zoo drowns because, for complex reasons, Pi's family decides to move along with the zoo to America, and they go by boat, and the boat sinks with everyone and all the animals in it, and Pi is left on the boat with a tiger and an orangutan. And the story is then what happens on that boat. So that's moving away from the whole zoo idea. But the whole premise of the book begins with a zoo, and it's very beautifully described. I'm just going to read one little bit more of The Life of Pi, because I think it's one of the best zoo-related books in my present collection tonight. This is chapter 9. Getting animals used to the presence of humans is at the heart of the art and science of zookeeping. The key aim is to diminish an animal's flight distance, which is the minimum distance at which an animal wants to keep a perceived enemy. A flamingo in the wild won't mind you if you stay more than 300 yards away. Cross that limit and it becomes tense. Get even closer and you trigger a flight reaction from which the bird will not cease until the 300-yard limit is set again, or until heart and lungs fail. Different animals have different flight distances, and they gauge them in different ways. Cats look, deer listen, bears smell. Giraffes will allow you to come to within 30 yards of them if you're in a motor car, but will run if you're 150 yards away on foot. Fiddler crabs scurry when you're 10 yards away. Howler monkeys stir in their branches when you're at 20. African buffaloes react at 75. There's a lot of pretty fascinating facts within the book of that ilk. But if you haven't read it for a while, I would really urge you to reread it, because it's a brilliant read. Going back to, lots of people know there's an element of unreliable narrator and an element of magic realism, which make the book flip you on your head when you come to the end of it and want to go back and read it all over again. A couple of other zoo-related stories to briefly mention are Tobermory by Saki, who's one of my favourite writers. He writes brilliant short stories. Tobermory is a really good short story to read aloud. My dad read it to us when I was probably about 10. It's lived with me forever since. And it's a very strange story about a cat who is taught to speak by his owner. So Mr. Cornelius Appin teaches a cat to talk. And some really terrible things happen because the cat has been observing the humans in a horrifyingly cat-like way and has a lot of evil thoughts about humans, which it then expresses when it learns to talk. So there's a lot of dramas that happen when the cat learns to talk in this story, Tobermory. But then, a few weeks later, an elephant in the Dresden Zoological Garden, which had shown no previous signs of irritability, broke loose and killed an Englishman who had apparently been teasing it. Clovis, who is a character in the book, who is in many of Saki's stories, he's a character that runs through all the stories, observes, if he was trying German irregular verbs on the poor beast, he deserved all he got, which is a very typical kind of Saki-like expression. Then The Hairy Ape by Eugene O'Neill is a play, which is a very strange play, in which Yank, a ship's stoker, loses his self-esteem when a woman calls him a beast. In the zoo, he seeks kinship with a gorilla and says, "Ain't we both members of the same club, the Hairy Apes?" And the gorilla then wraps his arms around Yank in a murderous hug. And you literally hear the crackling snap of crushed ribs. That mention of The Hairy Ape by Eugene O'Neill makes me think of the fantastic book The Woman and the Ape by Peter Berg, which is a book that I do often refer back to because I love it, which is about a woman who falls in love with an amazingly intelligent ape who can actually talk. So it's not about zoos, but it's about cross species understanding. More of which coming up soon when I'm going to be talking about this book, Being a Beast, which is an amazing book. Coming to that in a bit. So, The Old Men at the Zoo by Angus Wilson is a kind of dystopian future novel, which I think was written in the 1960s, not exactly sure when, but it's a book describing in the near future, Britain is at war with an alliance of European powers. The narrator, whose name is Simon Carter, is the secretary of London Zoo, whose troubles weirdly echo those of the political world. And the zoo gets a new lease of life when political prisoners are sacrificed to the animals to entertain the public. So, this is The Old Men at the Zoo, quite a dark, interesting dystopian novel, uh, which is the last novel that Angus Wilson wrote. But Angus Wilson does write very beautifully. So, it's an interesting one to add to the list of zoo literature. We must just mention Ted Hughes's poem, The Jaguar, which describes the jaguar at the zoo, where most of the wild beasts have become indolent and tame. Here's some quotes from that poem. The apes yawn and adore their fleas in the sun. The parrots strut like cheap tarts to attract the stroller with the nut. Only the jaguar keeps his primal intensity, pacing his cage, hurrying, enraged, through prison darkness after the drills of his eyes, on a short, fierce fuse. That's The Jaguar by Ted Hughes. Always good to go to Ted Hughes for animal descriptions. Another great zoo book, which people don't necessarily remember these days, except that it's been made into a rather fabulous film. Just making sure my tiger makeup isn't blurring, is Turtle Diary by Russell Hoban. So Russell Hoban wrote a lot of children's books and is a really brilliant and unusual writer who wrote many books like, well, for adults, Ridley Walker, which is probably his most famous, Turtle Diary, The Medusa Frequency, Amaryllis Night and Day. But then he also wrote lots of fantastic children's books, which featured a temperamental badger called Francis, whose escapades were based partly on the experiences of Russell Hoban's four children, whose names were Phoebe, Brom, Esme, and Julia. I'll just read you a little bit of a poem from one of those because it just gives you a flavour of what Russell Hoban is like as a writer, because I think he is brilliant. Frances did not eat her egg. She sang a little song to it. She sang the song very softly. I do not like the way you slide. I do not like your soft inside. I do not like you lots of ways, and I could do for many days without eggs. Love that. So, The Turtle Diary by Russell Hoban, some of you might have seen the film, is narrated by two depressed middle-aged Londoners. One's called Naira, who's the author of a popular series of children's books about a character of Gillian Vole, but she hasn't written much of anything lately and is having a crisis of confidence over her first adult book proposal. She's just purchased a pet water beetle and looks to it for ideas. And then there's William G, our other narrator, so it's two narrators, who used to have a family and a career in advertising, but now he's divorced, working in a bookstore, living in a boarding house. So they're both a bit depressed. William and Nera are strangers at the beginning of the book, and we observe as their stories get closer and closer together. They have many things in common. They both have a dry sense of humour, unrealised ambitions, anxiety, depression, and London Zoo, which is what brings them together. And they both develop a strange obsession with releasing the turtles back into the wild. Here's a little quote from the book. There they were in the golden green murk of their little box of sea, their little bedsitter of ocean, writes William. One almost expected a meter in the corner of it where they had to put in 5p to keep the water circulating. Thousands of miles in their speechless eyes. The sea turtles deeply move William and Nera in a way the other animals don't. William daydreams vividly about their journeys across thousands of miles across the ocean. Shy, reserved Nera pictures herself smashing them free of their tank with a sledgehammer. Separately, each decides that the turtles should be kidnapped and released into the ocean. So they decide that separately. Then they finally meet each other, and we very much root for them, both in their desire to release the turtles, and we hope that there's going to be a romance between the two. I won't tell you what happens if you don't know the story, because it is a really lovely book and a really lovely film as well. That's Turtle Diaries by Russell Hoban. There's a zoo scene in American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, a highly controversial book, which I won't go into too much detail about at the moment because there's a lot of horror in it. But just to mention the zoo scene, Patrick Bateman, who is the psychopathic yuppie narrator, commits one of the nastiest of the many murders that he commits in New York's Central Park Zoo. Strolling through the menagerie, he encounters a small child whose mother is briefly distracted, and he duly dispatches him. He leaves the zoo with his hands soaked in blood, but unapprehended as ever, because Patrick Bateman seems to get away with it throughout the book. So that's another story, but it is an interesting zoo scene. Then in Moon Tiger by Penelope Lively, which was another Booker Prize winner, the zoo is where divorced parents take their estranged children for a lovely day out, which actually sounds so depressing. In Lively's multiple narrator novel, one section is given over to selfish Claudia's little daughter, Lisa, who describes a day at London Zoo with her mother and Jasper, her careless father, in which they talked about mating and sex in a very factual way, which probably then had a strong effect on the rest of her life. So one more zoo book to mention before I come on to this rather fascinating non-fiction book about zoos is A Strange Barn by Lavinia Greenlaw, which is a sequence of poems from Greenlaw's Minsk collection, which explores the different animal enclosures at London Zoo, reaching out to events occurring in the years in which they were built. So this is poetry again. There is a lot of poetry set in zoos. The aviary is linked to the making of Hitchcock's film The Birds. The penguins in their 1934 pool tell us about the rise of fascism. So that is a really interesting aside that you can read some rather brilliant poetry by Lavinia Greenlaw in her collection called Minsk, which is also an award-winning collection. So, suddenly getting quite hot with this animal beast that I'm wearing. So now I want to talk to you about this amazing book, Being a Beast by Charles Foster. Thanks to Suze for giving this book to my daughter Calypso, and I have been reading it, and it is fantastic. So this book is a very, very unusual nature book, which has a terrific premise. The premise is that the writer, Foster, seeks to live literally as a badger, as an otter, a fox, a stag, and a swift, in order to better understand their lives and ours. So this might seem like a completely mad and barking idea and like something someone's just doing for a bit of a stunt, but far from it. Charles Foster is completely dedicated to this idea of trying to fully understand what it is to be a beast. And it is an amazing read because he really does his utmost to get inside the head of various different animals to the point where he actually goes to live in an improvised badger's set, which a Welsh farmer helped him dig out with a large machine with his 8-year-old son. So he takes his 8-year-old son with him to learn to be a badger, and they live in the woods and literally do eat worms. So he discovers in his many experiments, Charles Foster, that worms from the Chablis region of France, when chewed, have a long mineral finish. Worms from Picardy are apparently musty like splintered woods. Worms from the High Kent Weald are fresh and uncomplicated. They sound quite nice. And worm flavours change with the season as well as the region. Norfolk worms have a tang of nappy liner in August, but paraffin in January. Who wants to try and eat worms? Well, Charles Foster does. He is completely dedicated to being a beast. And he also lives as an urban fox for several weeks and learns a huge amount about what it is to be an urban fox. So I'm talking about this book because although it's not about a zoo, it's about the understanding of animals. And it is a really fascinating and brilliant read. And it's a great one to read as an adjunct to the other zoo books that I've been mentioning, because it's a very new look at the consciousness of animals by Charles Foster. And it's a great one to read, for instance, in conjunction with reading Gerald Durrell, for instance, which is much more of an anthropomorphizing kind of read in which he does give the animals human characteristics, whereas Charles Foster is doing his absolute best to do the opposite and not attempt to anthropomorphize animals at all, but to try and understand what it is to be an animal. So he munches worms because worms constitute the bulk of a British badger's diet, and Foster goes to live in Wales to live life as a badger, accompanied by his 8-year-old son, Tom. A JCB driving farmer friend helps them dig a set in the hillside, and there they take up residence. It's kind of hilarious, kind of mad, kind of absolutely brilliant. And the more you read it, the more obsessed you'll get, and you might find yourself actually wanting to go into the woods and try to live as a badger or an otter or a fox or a swift. So I'm going to read you a little bit, and it will hopefully give you an idea of the fabulousness of this book. And it's also kind of very existential and spiritual as a read, because it really makes you think about what it is to be human and what it is to be an animal and what it is to have consciousness in any way. So this is in the chapter called Otter. I'm always after them, always looking at faint tracks on a patch of mud or a sandbank, always sniffing at little piles of dung, always looking at an old dead fish with its liver sucked out like a milkshake through a hole behind the gills. I've never been ahead of them or with them. Sometimes I've had, for a whole moment at a time, the laughable conceit that, that I've ambushed them, that I've got there before them, and they've walked in on the stage that I built. But no, they're only seen when they chose to be seen. I resent this very much. They give nothing, not even the delusion of companionability. Otters deny reciprocity even more shockingly than cats. It's even more disturbing than their wiredness or their sleepless, trembling, thirsty killing. After them, into the water I went. It's important to be in the water for a long time. An experience of anything for 10 minutes is not qualitatively the same as an experience of an hour. Neurobiological arithmetic is odd. The difference between 20 minutes and 10 minutes is not 10 minutes. This is where it gets interesting, I have to say. If you don't believe me, get up early in the morning and sit cross-legged on a cushion with your eyes shut, trying to think of nothing. Pick up each intruding thought between your finger and thumb and sling it out of your mind. Do it every morning for 3 months. Then tell me that 10 minutes plus 10 minutes is 20 minutes. Which is why, despite all my macho posturing and all my subcutaneous fat, I tended to wear a wetsuit. A good case can be made for the wretched things on other grounds too. He hates wetsuits, but he feels he's got to wear them. Otters, unlike me, have very little fat, but they have instead 2 layers of hair, a fine underlayer and a coarse outer coat. They trap air very effectively, and air is an appalling conductor of heat and thus an excellent insulator. Wetsuits work in a similar way. Most of their insulation comes from nitrogen bubbles trapped in the neoprene. It's more otter-like, not less, to wear one. So that's Charles Foster's long justification of why he should wear a wetsuit when he's in the water looking at otters. And it's a perfectly reasonable justification and makes complete sense. And I love the way he talks about time not being 10 minutes and 10 minutes is not 20 minutes. If you spend longer in the water with otters than 20 minutes, then you have a completely different experience than if you just do 10 minutes and then another 10 minutes. I'll read you a little bit more because I do think he writes very brilliantly and very philosophically. The days were easy. I plunged in and drifted down face first, pausing to nudge and grope. But for a lot of the day, like the otters, I lay up near the water. At first, before I discovered the river night, I lay up so that I could hear and smell and see what was in the otter's day. Later, when I began to know the night, I lay up because I was tired from the previous night in the river and wanted all my senses to work properly when the sun dissolved in the water and the real show started. Otters have many favourite laying up spots. They have to with such large territories. They're not particularly fussy. Their needs are mine. They want somewhere dry, safe, and ideally quiet. They don't need a vaulted ancestral palace under an ancient ash. A drain pipe will do, or a shaded couch of stranded driftgrass out of the reach of lolloping dogs. I've slept in a pipe too, dumped outside Rochester by a contractor, full of rabbit bones, nappies, and syringes. A bull terrier waddled in, looking for trouble. I snarled and nearly bit his head off. I hope he's in therapy forever. But usually I curled up within a stone's throw of the river, listening with one waking ear, resenting the gossiping hikers, looking for the night. In my mind, the river has 2 seasons, light and darkness, life and death. Spring and autumn are desperate Manichaean battlegrounds. The summer breathes and throbs. The winter does not. The heart of the world stops. The world doesn't even wheeze. He then has quite a long discussion about why he hates the winter and how you shouldn't really call him a proper nature writer and that we should demand 25% off this book because he hates the winter so much and he doesn't like writing about it. Just want to read you one last bit because I think it is an excellent and really challenging and really fascinating read. Everyone should read it. In fact, it was published in 2016 and it should have had a lot more attention. Now he's talking about the winter again. I've tried to stay, I really have, but I've just been going through the motions. Sometimes the motions have been fairly strenuous. I floated and stumbled in December down from Badgeworthy to Watersmeet, stumbling because the proprioceptors in my limbs stopped telling me where those limbs were in space. I've rummaged in January in the flooded roots of the waterside trees, expecting big sluggish fish to be dozing there, but getting nothing but fingers like blue carrots. And knowing that the cold and that urgent calorific imperative send otters wandering ever more widely. I've tramped and tramped the riverbanks and the watersheds, trying to feel in touch with the otters or in touch with anything outside myself. I failed. It's like sitting in the Bodleian Library besieged by email, my brain bruised to spasm and uselessness by the attrition of all the daily littlenesses. The cold of the moor does that to me too. The littlenesses have to stop before my brain can come out of spasm and grasp things again. The sun has to come back before there's any chance of empathy or even half decent observation on the riverbank. But when it does, there's the euphoric woo whoop of the depressive surging back onto a manic wave top. Then I'm not just a pedestrian sniffer of spraint and a trudging, grudging collector of adjectives. I'm a blooming shaman, impossible to live with, pretentious beyond endurance. But I can't do the winter. This is actually a really interesting bit. It's one of the moments that I love in the book. This tells me something worth knowing. A depressed shaman, hunter, or naturalist can't work at all. A grey soul, apparently, can't penetrate that thin veil between the species. I don't understand the metaphysics, but it seems that you have to be sufficiently I to be another, and depression erodes the I below the critical point. This is interesting. Perhaps for a human, being an animal is just an extreme mode of empathy, no different in kind from what you need to be a decent lover or father or colleague. When you're depressed, you might simply be nursing that injured I too obsessively to have the energy or attention necessary for empathy. Our nursing strategies are radically misconceived. They all tend to be based on the disastrous misconception that if you give yourself away, there will be less of you. In fact, of course, as we know when the sun shines, the very opposite is true. Or perhaps, if you prefer the epic language of the shaman, travel between worlds is a strenuous business, not for those with any disability. Remember the Levitical prohibition on disabled priests, and the shamanic world is a gift culture. The gift required is the only one you can give, yourself. The spirit otters guarding the gate won't beckon you in with welcoming paws to a sumptuous eel feast if they see you limping or bearing, wrapped in lily leaves and red ribbon, a mere effigy of yourself. They demand the real thing. He's talking about metaphorical disabilities here, I do believe. So there you go. That is Being a Beast by Charles Foster, which I think is a great book to read in conjunction with all the other really interesting zoo books that I've been discussing this evening. So we started off with Gerald, Durrell, A Zoo in My Luggage. Fantastic and easy, fun, light read. Then we also talked about Tobermory by Saki, which only very briefly mentions a zoo, but it's a really fun read about a cat who learns how to speak. It's another book about animal human consciousness. The Hairy Ape by Eugene O'Neill, which is a play in which a mistaken Yank thinks that he has a lot in common with an ape and actually gets crushed. The Old Men at the Zoo by Angus Wilson, which is a kind of dystopian novel about things all going horribly wrong and political prisoners being sacrificed to the animals in the zoo to entertain the public. The Jaguar by Ted Hughes, which is a fantastic poem about a jaguar in a zoo. Turtle Diaries by Russell Hoban, fantastic, surreal, great, well, not surreal actually, fantastic, loving story about two slightly depressed people who want to let turtles out and release them into the sea. And The Life of Pi, of course, by Jan Martel, which is an absolutely fantastic read, and which, if you're going to read one zoo book, apart from Gerald Durrell, definitely read The Life of Pi. And then I also mentioned American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, which has a really grim and horrific murder in a zoo in Central Park. Moon Tiger by Penelope Lively, which also has a depressing zoo scene when divorced parents take their daughter to the zoo. And I think that is it. But I would love to know if you have any zoo books that I haven't mentioned for adults, which I would love to know about. And I will do a session in the near future about zoos in children's books, because that's a really fun one as well. Fun topic. And there's obviously a lot of zoos in children's books. Dr. Dolittle, got to mention him. So on that merry note, I'm going to stop for the night, and do let me know if you have any other bibliotherapy suggestions, themes you'd like me to tackle, or ailments that you would like to be addressed. One of them could be having a unicorn horn in your imagination. This is something that I found in my parents' house not that long ago, and I'm not actually sure what it was. I think it might be from Africa. So, thanks for joining me this evening. See you next week. By the way, I'm going to be doing a session with Antoine Laurent on probably, hopefully, the 6th of March. I will advertise that. He is a fantastic French best-selling author. He wrote an amazing book called The Red Notebook, which was a fantastic read. And his latest book, An Astronomer in Love, is the one that we're going to be talking about, but we're just going to be having a general discussion. I'm going to put him on the couch under the covers and talk to him about his life in books. So do join me for that, probably on the 6th of March. Lovely to see you this evening. Thanks for joining me. See you next week.